Senator Nevada is recognized.
Mr. President, would the chair advise me when I've used 12 minutes of my time?
I will do that.
Mr. President, this report that was released yesterday has taken about 2 years for the General Accounting Office to conduct. The findings of this report, if it centered on a member of Congress or the Congress or an agency of the federal government, would be, for lack of a better word, scandalous. But it's interesting to note of the apologists that are around this country for the Federal Reserve Board. Take, for example, the Wall Street Journal. They wrote an article on the release of this report today, but it was an apology for the Federal Reserve Board. The Wall Street Journal looks at the members of Congress or federal agencies, and anything they do, if they don't dot an I on the right place in the page, don't cross the T, they not only report it, but they write an editorial about it. This $3.7 billion, the huge cost overruns, not a word said in today's Wall Street Journal. But it's very typical for that newspaper. Mr. President, this report raises legitimate questions about fiscal management within the Federal Reserve System. Some important questions should be answered as we proceed, Senator Dorgan and I, with our legislative agenda as it relates to this General Accounting Office report. And I think there should be some questions asked during the confirmation proceedings relating to Alan Greenspan. We conducted this study because, as we have been told by the General Accounting Office, this is the most in-depth study they've ever done of the Federal Reserve Board. And all the time I've been in Congress, certainly it's the most in-depth study by far that's ever been done in the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve, I agree they should be independent, and I think that I will do what I can to make sure that it's independent. But that does not mean that the Federal Reserve Board and system does not need accountability. It needs accountability as indicated in the 200-page report that's taken 2 years to prepare by the General Accounting Office. Mr. President, I think what the Federal Reserve Board has been saying is, don't do as I do as I say, because they say that government has to cut back. But what do? They increase their spending in all areas significantly. Take, for example, the operating costs of the Federal Reserve System. Supervision and regulation from 1988 to 1994 has increased 102%. 102%. An annual audit, certainly, Mr. President, is the least that we should get out of this. We should know what is happening in the Federal Reserve System. A ray of sunlight should begin shining on the Federal Reserve System. It may not need to be part of our sunshine laws that were so popular a decade or two ago, but it needs a ray of sunshine shining on it. It would instill greater public confidence in our banking system. It's important. I've talked only a little bit about the increased operating costs, but the costs certainly have skyrocketed. And we're talking about big money, Mr. President. From 1988 to 1994, the costs have gone up to from $1.3 billion to $2 billion. That's a lot of money. Operating costs for the Federal Reserve have grown at twice the rate of inflation. Fed operating costs jumped 50% between 88 and 94. Mr. President, I have behind me here a visual aid, and I think it's pretty clear if we look at what's happened with travel within the Federal Reserve System. It's gone up 66%. We see what's happened in the federal government. It's gone up 4%. Staffing levels, federal government, minus 2%. We see what's happened with the Federal Reserve System. It's incredible, Mr. President, 44%. These costs are a story in and of themselves, I would think. From 1988 to 1994, the Fed's salary costs increased by 44%, compared to increased 44%. Interestingly, also, salaries of Reserve Bank presidents are greater than the chairman, significantly. They vary. Somebody in San Francisco makes more than somebody in St. Louis. It's interesting. There's no conformity as to how much they make. They can kind of pay themselves to guess what they want. 120 top Fed officials earn more than the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, Alan Greenspan. Within the Federal Reserve System, their benefits increased by 89%, whereas in the rest of the federal government, Mr. President, we've been reining in the costs. Theirs have gone up almost 90%. And I might say, we talked about the travel expenses increasing by 66%, but they travel in style. In 1994, the Fed's travel expenditures were over $42 million. They're permitted to be reimbursed however they feel they should be reimbursed. They can be reimbursed per diem. They can be reimbursed actual costs. How would this institution work if that, in fact, every member of Congress could be reimbursed for travel costs, whatever they felt was appropriate? There needs to be some uniformity. Because the policy varies from bank to bank, these costs could easily be contained by a uniform, more taxpayer-friendly policy. Senator Dorgan has talked about the double standard, and certainly there is a double standard. When we also understand, Mr. President, that 93.25% of all the work that the Fed does has nothing to do with monetary policy. Only a little over 6.5% of what they do relates to monetary policy. That's why I agree wholeheartedly with my friend, the junior senator from North Dakota, that, in fact, they should be subject to the appropriation process, because they should be. I'm a member of the Appropriations Committee, and we spend most of our time trying to figure out a way to downsize, to cut budgets, to eliminate programs. At the same time, the Fed is telling us that we need to do this. At the same time, their costs are spiraling. The rest of the government underwent necessary belt tightening. The Fed enjoyed a smorgasbord of growth. They picked whatever they wanted. While the federal government's overall staffing level declined by 2%, the Fed staffing level increased 6% over that. So we know that there needs to be better internal management. The General Accounting Office found this. Mr. President, I've gone around this state of Nevada, and people ask questions about the Fed, and I've introduced legislation in the past to have an annual audit of the Federal Reserve System. It's gotten nowhere. It's gotten from being introduced to the garbage can. But now there are facts to indicate that what I've been talking about is absolutely necessary, that we do need to have an annual report. We do need better management control within the Fed. We don't know how costs have gone up the last year and a half or so, but between 1998 and 94, let me repeat, personnel compensation increased by 54%, equipment and software expenditures increased by 85%, building expenditures increased by 34%, and as I've already talked about, travel expenditures increased by 66%. There's very little incentive within the Fed to keep these expenditures under control. The Fed isn't subject to the same cost reduction pressures that are affecting both public and private agencies. The $3.7 billion slush fund, Mr. President, that they have, that they keep around for losses that may occur, and that haven't had any occurred in 79 years. I'm on Appropriations Committee. We're now in conference trying to work out the disputes that we have. We badly need a few more dollars to allow this omnibus bill to be signed, these 5 appropriation bills. Mr. President, it could be done if we had the Fed's money that's sitting there gathering dust. We would be We would solve the problems. The federal government would be financed. We wouldn't need any more continuing resolutions. So we know, as the Senator from North Dakota has indicated, that we need to do something legislatively. We first must have the $3.7 billion returned to Treasury. We need to require an annual audit, an independent audit. We need to institute uniform procurement and contracting practices. We need to institute executive branch policies relating to travel, benefits, and security. We certainly need to do that at a minimum. I think it would be well that we tie the salaries of federal executives to similarly situated government personnel. And we need to subject the Fed's monetary policy operations to their non-monetary policy operations to the appropriations process. That's the least we can do. I think it's also says a lot, Mr. President, when we realize that the Federal Reserve, as described by my friend from North Dakota, has had this beautiful home, that we can just see the top of that home. We can't see it all because there's a huge fence around it. We know we have responsibilities for the structure and the landscaping in there, but we can't see it. All we're asking in this report is let us find out what's going on. It's important. It's an important... They conduct important functions to this government, and we should know more about what they do. Mr. President, we have to do away with the shroud of secrecy. We have to peel back this cloak that they've covered themselves with since 1913. This rainy day fund that they've set up is not a rainy day fund, it's a hurricane. And they have this spending free-for-all attitude that's got to stop. They have a blank check mentality. I'd like to know who's minding the shop, because 1913 accounting practices must be put to a stop.